"Your sister never would have done this," my mother-in-law said, right there at the dinner table, loud enough for everyone to hear. She meant my husband's ex. She always meant her. I set down my fork, looked at the woman across from me, and said very quietly, "You're right. She wouldn't have, because she never owned the house you're sitting in." The table went silent. My husband's hand found my knee under the tablecloth. Not to comfort me, I realized later, to warn me. That was the moment I understood that the 3 years I had spent quietly holding this entire family together had made me invisible. I had mistaken being essential for being valued. I was about to correct that mistake. I should back up because the story doesn't start at that dinner table. It starts 6 years ago in a rented basement suite in Burnaby, where I was 28 years old and eating instant noodles for the third night in a row because I had just put my last paycheck toward my mother-in-law's property tax bill. My name is Petra. I'm a software developer. I started coding when I was 15, built my first app at 22, and by 26 I was pulling in a salary that made my colleagues blink. It wasn't family money or a lucky break. It was years of night shifts and contract work and saying no to vacations and yes to every certification course I could find. By the time I married my husband, Liam, I had a down payment saved for a condo, a clean credit score, and a very clear picture of what financial stability looked like. What I did not have was any idea what I was marrying into. Liam is kind. That is the truest thing I can say about him. He is genuinely, almost painfully kind. The sort of man who will drive 40 minutes in February to help a stranger jump their car. He is also, as I came to understand, slowly and then all at once, completely unable to say no to his mother. His mother's name is Paulette. She is 63 years old and has not worked since Liam was in middle school. His father left when Liam was 17, took most of the savings, and Paulette spent the years after that building a narrative in which she was the eternal victim and Liam was her lifeline. By the time I met him, the dynamic was so deep, it was structural. She didn't ask him for things. She simply presented her needs as facts, and he responded. His car payment was late. Paulette needed her roof repaired. His lease renewal was coming up. Paulette's furnace had died. There was always something, and there was always Liam. His brother, Theo, was 8 years younger, still living at home at 25, working part-time at a sporting goods store, and broadly considered by Paulette to be in the delicate and ongoing process of finding himself. Theo had the easy charm of someone who had never once been held accountable for anything. He told big, entertaining stories about his plans. He had once briefly tried to start a landscaping company. Before that, a food truck. Before that, he had enrolled in a film program at Langara, lasted 1 semester, and described dropping out as a creative pivot. Paula discussed his ambitions with a reverence she had never once extended to my actual functioning career. When Liam and I got married, I came into the marriage with 2 assets: the condo I had purchased in East Vancouver and a structured investment account I'd been building for 4 years. Liam had a modest RRSP and a good heart. We talked openly about money before we got married, which I thought meant we had an understanding. What I didn't fully grasp was that his family's financial needs were not a variable he'd ever thought to include in that conversation, because to him, they were not a decision. They were just life. The first year, I noticed things without naming them. Paulette's heat pump replacement, Theo's new truck. Liam co-signed the loan because Theo's credit was thin, and when I raised an eyebrow, Liam said it was just paperwork. Theo would handle the payments. For 8 months, Theo did. Then he didn't. Liam quietly covered it, and when I found out I wasn't angry, exactly, I was unsettled. There was a system operating in this family that I had not been shown the schematics for. By year 2, I had named it. I sat down one Saturday morning with a coffee and a spreadsheet and added up every dollar that had moved from our household to Liam's family in the previous 12 months. The number was $31,000. I stared at it for a long time. Then I added up what we had contributed to our own mortgage, our own retirement accounts, our own emergency fund. The proportions were not what I would have chosen. I brought it to Liam that evening. He listened. He got quiet in the way he does when something is true, but painful. He said he didn't realize it had added up to that much. He said he'd talked to his mom. He said Theo was getting back on his feet. He said things were going to stabilize. I believed him because I wanted to and because I am, at my core, a person who prefers to solve problems rather than sit inside them. Things did not stabilize. By year 3, I had done something I am still not sure how to feel about. I had, without fully admitting it to myself, started funding his family more deliberately. Part of it was pragmatic. Paulette's house, a 3-bedroom rancher in Coquitlam she had owned since the 90s, though the mortgage had been refinanced twice in ways that left her with almost no equity, was in a state of genuine disrepair. The gutters were pulling away from the fascia. The hot water tank was well past its lifespan. Liam was going to help her deal with it regardless of whether I was involved, and I thought that if I was involved, I could at least make it efficient. So I structured it. I sat down with a contractor, got quotes, managed the project myself because I knew how to manage projects and Paulette did not. I paid for most of it through a family account I set up for this purpose. I told myself this was temporary, a one-time investment in a property that, after all, would eventually belong to Liam. I did not examine that logic very closely. Then Theo had an idea. His idea was an app. Of course it was. He had heard me talk about my work often enough to absorb the vocabulary without absorbing any of the substance. He wanted to build a platform. He used that word, platform, that would connect local hockey parents with gear resellers, a second-hand equipment marketplace but curated. He had a name picked out and a logo his friend had designed and a whole energy about it that Paulette described as entrepreneurial fire. I am a software developer. I know specifically and precisely what building and maintaining a functional marketplace application actually costs and requires. What Theo was describing was not a business plan, it was a vibe. But Liam came to me with it, his voice careful and a little hopeful, and I thought about the $31,000 and I thought about the gutters, and I thought if this works, maybe they become self-sufficient. Maybe this is the last thing. I agreed to fund the development through a numbered company I set up for the purpose in which Theo and I were equal partners. I hired a developer I trusted, managed the build myself, got it to a functional MVP. I put in $42,000. Theo put in the idea and his name on the incorporation documents. The app launched. It got modest traction, a few hundred users in the Lower Mainland, some decent word of mouth in hockey communities in Burnaby and Surrey. It was not a failure exactly. What it was unmanaged. Theo stopped responding to the developer's questions. He stopped posting on the social accounts. He was excited by the launch and bored by the operation, and within 8 months the platform had stagnated and was hemorrhaging the small monthly hosting and maintenance costs I was covering. When I asked Theo for the financials, my right as an equal partner, he sent me a screenshot of a Google Sheet that had not been updated in 4 months. I hired an accountant to look at what I had. I want to say here that nothing she found surprised me. That is the part I find hardest to sit with. She found that Theo had expensed, through the company account I funded, 3 flights, 1 to Whistler, 1 to Toronto, 1 to Kelowna, as business travel. She found expenses coded as equipment and marketing that corresponded, after some cross-referencing, to concert tickets, a lease payment on a new snowboard, and a hotel stay in Tofino. She found that the incorporation documents I thought were standard had been altered after the fact. My signature on an amended agreement, one I had never signed or seen, that reclassified my capital contributions as loans with no repayment schedule and no interest. Someone had replicated my signature on a legal document. The accountant set her pen down and said, very professionally, that I should speak to a lawyer before I did anything else. I called my lawyer that same afternoon. Her name is Irene and she has seen everything. She did not seem surprised. She said, first things first. She said, is the house in Coquitlam still in your name? And I said, no, it's in Paulette's name. And she said, and the numbered company, and I said, it's still equally shared. I haven't changed anything. And she said, good. Leave it that way for now. And then she walked me through exactly what I was looking at and what my options were. That night, I did not sleep. I lay in the dark next to Liam and thought about the dinner where Paulette had made her comment about his ex. That had been 2 months ago. I had replayed it a dozen times since then, picking at it the way you pick at something you know is going to hurt more if you keep touching it. His ex had been sweet, Paulette always said. Accommodating. Easy to be around. What she meant, I had come to understand, was that his ex had not had money of her own. There was nothing to want from her, and so she had seemed generous by simply not being a burden. I was a burden of a different kind. I was useful. I was the one who could be drawn on. And the problem with being useful to people who have decided you're a resource rather than a person is that they don't think about what happens when the resource runs out. They don't think about it because they can't imagine it. I spent the next 2 weeks doing things quietly. Irene filed the initial paperwork to trigger a formal partnership dispute which legally froze any changes to the numbered company. I moved my personal accounts to a different institution, one that had no connection to the joint account Liam and I shared for household expenses. I had a long, careful conversation with my financial advisor about what was protected and what was exposed and what I needed to do. I did not tell Liam any of this. I know how that sounds, but I had spent 3 years telling Liam things and 3 years watching him hear me, and then, with the kindness that was genuinely his nature, absorb what I'd said and let his mother's reality reshape it. I needed to understand the full picture before I handed him any part of it, because once I did, it would go to Paulette within 48 hours. That was not a criticism of him. It was just a fact. The call that broke everything open came from Theo. He called on a Wednesday afternoon, which already told me something because Theo does not call, Theo texts, and he texts in fragments and usually about himself. A phone call from Theo meant he wanted something and had calculated that a phone call would be more effective. He was, to his credit, charming about it. He said he had an investor interested in the platform, an actual investor, a guy he'd met at a networking event in Gastown. He said the investor wanted to see clean financials and a clear ownership structure before he committed. He said this was the moment. This was what all the early work had been building toward. Then he said he needed me to sign a document that would reclassify my ownership share from 50% to 20% to make the deal more attractive. I let the silence stretch out for several seconds. Theo, I said finally, who do you think signed the amendment to the original incorporation agreement? There was a pause. What do you mean? I mean, I said, that my lawyer has a copy of an amendment with my signature on it that I never signed, and I'm asking you who you think produced that document. Another pause. Longer this time? Ellie, look, Dad, he started. It's Petra, I said, and finished that sentence. Please. He didn't. I told him I needed to go and I hung up. I sat very still in my home office, an office in the condo I owned, in the building I had purchased with money I had earned, and I let the full weight of what I already knew settle into something I could act on. That Sunday, Paulette had her weekly family dinner. She had been hosting these since before Liam and I were married, and I had never in 6 years missed one. I drove to Coquitlam. I sat down at the table in the house where the gutters now worked and the hot water tank was new and the floors had been refinished the previous spring, all of it paid for by me. I ate her pot roast. I answered her questions about work with short, polite answers. After dinner, when Liam and Theo were doing dishes and Paulette and I were alone at the table with our tea, I said very calmly, I know about the amended document, Paulette. She didn't flinch. She looked at me over her mug and said, I don't know what you mean. The amendment that reclassifies my contributions as a loan, the one with my signature that I didn't sign. She set her mug down, and then she said something I will not forget. She said, everything you put into this family you put in willingly. We didn't ask you to. If you're unhappy with how things worked out, that's not something we did to you. I looked at her for a long moment. I thought about how to respond and decided honesty was the only thing I had left to lose. You're right, I said. I put it in willingly. I thought I was building something with people who saw me as family. I was wrong about that. And I think, given what your son has done with those documents, you're going to find out very quickly that there are legal consequences for being wrong in that particular direction. I excused myself, got my coat, and drove home. I called Liam on the way and told him I needed to talk to him when he got back and that it was important and that he should come home before stopping anywhere else. He came home. I sat him down. I showed him the accountant's report. I showed him the amendment. I showed him the timeline Irene had reconstructed of every dollar that had flowed from our household to his family in 6 years. The total was $114,000. Liam is not a stupid man. He sat with that number and he turned the color of old snow. He said, "My mom knew about this?" I said I believed so. Yes. He sat very quietly. Then he said, "Did you know when you came to dinner tonight?" I said yes. He looked at me with something I can only describe as grief and said, "You could have told me." And I said, very gently, because I did love him and some part of me still does, "Liam, every time I've told you something about your family, what happened?" He didn't answer, because he knew. I want to be honest here about what came next, because the story could be told as a clean revenge arc, and it wasn't. The weeks after that conversation were not triumphant. They were exhausting and miserable, and there were nights I sat in my car in the parking garage of my building and just cried. Not even about the money, really, but about the particular grief of realizing you spent years building something on a foundation other people had already decided didn't include you. Liam confronted Theo. Theo, to his credit, did not lie. He told Liam that Paulette had suggested the loan reclassification, that she had said it was technically legal given how the documents were structured, that she had a friend who was a notary. He told Liam he hadn't thought it would matter because, as Paulette had put it, Petra has plenty. She won't even notice. She has plenty. She won't even notice. Liam told me this, sitting at our kitchen table at 2 a.m, and there was something in his face that had shifted, some organizing principle he had built his whole understanding of his family around that had quietly given out. He said, "I don't know who these people are." And I said, "You do. You've always known. You just love them too much to look directly at it." Irene filed the full legal action 3 weeks later. The partnership dispute triggered an automatic audit of the numbered company. The replicated signature on the amendment was sent to a forensic document examiner, a quiet, methodical woman who delivered her findings in a 7-page report that concluded, with professional certainty, that the signature was not mine. Theo retained his own lawyer. So did Paulette through a legal aid referral because she did not, in fact, have money of her own. Irene advised me that criminal charges for document forgery were available to me, and she laid out what that process would look like and what I would likely get from it. I thought about it for 4 days. Then I called Irene and told her I was not going to pursue criminal charges against Theo. What I was going to do was dissolve the numbered company entirely, recover my full capital contribution through the civil proceeding, and be done. I was also, Irene noted with approval, within my rights to demand repayment of the documented personal expenses Theo had run through the company account. The civil settlement took 4 months. I recovered $61,000, not everything, because some of the money was genuinely gone, spent on flights to Tofino and concert tickets and a snowboard that was already depreciating in someone's storage locker. But $61,000 was more than I had expected. Theo agreed to it without going to court, which told me the forensic report had scared him more than he let on. I did not pursue the rest. It was not generosity, it was a calculation. I knew what I would have to spend in time and energy to chase the remainder, and I had decided I was done spending things on this family. The question of Paulette's house was a separate matter entirely. She did not own the house. This had never been a secret exactly, but it also wasn't something that had ever been stated plainly. Years ago, before Liam and I were married, he had asked me if there was any way I could help stabilize his mother's situation. She was at risk of losing the house, behind on the mortgage, the bank had sent letters. I had agreed to purchase it through my numbered company and rent it back to her at a rate that covered the carrying costs. It had seemed at the time like a way to solve a real problem. What I had not understood was that Paulette had told herself a different story about that arrangement. She spoke about her house. She referred to it as hers. She had over the years made decisions about it, painting the exterior a color I found deeply unappealing, planting a garden that required ongoing irrigation system maintenance, as though the ownership question had simply been resolved in her favor by the passage of time. It had not. I gave 60 days' notice as required by BC tenancy law. The notice was delivered by a process server on a Tuesday morning. Paulette called Liam 17 times in the following 3 hours. He did not answer. He had, in those 4 months, quietly and painfully started to see the full picture of what had been happening. And while he was not the person I had married in the sense I had imagined, he was trying, in his way, to stand in the right place. The notice period passed. Paulette moved in with her sister in Maple Ridge. Theo moved into a bachelor suite in New Westminster and, from what I understand, started actually showing up regularly at the sporting goods store. The house went on the market in the spring. It sold in 11 days, which anyone who has looked at Vancouver real estate recently will understand is not remarkable. The sale recovered my initial investment and then some. The extended family, Liam's aunts, his cousins, a loose network of people who had always been politely warm to me and privately, I now suspected, referred to me as Liam's wife who works in tech, had a lot of opinions. His aunt called him. His cousin texted me a single sentence. "What you're doing to Paulette is cruel, and I hope you know that." I read it once and did not reply. Liam and I are still married. I say that because I think people expect a story like this to end with a divorce, and it didn't, though I understand why it might have. What happened instead was slower and stranger and harder to explain. Liam went to therapy. I went to therapy. We went together. There were months where I wasn't sure what I was doing or why I was still there, and there were months where I understood exactly, where I could see the person he was trying to become and believed he was capable of it. We moved to a different condo, mine, but different, in New Westminster, away from the geography of all of it. We did not have Sunday dinners with Paulette. We did not send money. Liam called her once a month, briefly, and I knew when he'd done it because he'd be quiet for the rest of the evening, processing whatever she'd said. I stopped asking about those calls. That was his relationship to manage. I had my own to rebuild. What I did with the money from the house sale was spend some of it on something that had been at the back of my mind for a long time. I partnered with a women in tech nonprofit in Vancouver to fund a mentorship bursary for young women in software development programs at BCIT and SFU, specifically women who were the first in their families to enter a technical field, which often means women who are doing it without a financial safety net. I went to the first information session. I sat in a room with 12 young women who were sharp and hungry and tired in the particular way of people who are working very hard with no margin for error. I told them one thing, because it was the only thing I was sure of. The work you do is yours. The money you earn is yours. Be generous, be loving, be good to the people you care about. But know the difference between generosity and being mistaken for an unlimited resource. That difference will matter. Make sure the people in your life know it too. I drove home after that in the kind of quiet that doesn't feel empty. The kind that feels, after a very long time, like your own. There's a moment in this story I keep coming back to. Not the dinner, not the forensic report, not even the day the eviction notice was served. It's a quieter moment, me, sitting alone in my car in a parking garage in New Westminster, not crying about the money, but about something harder to name. The specific grief of realizing that you were never actually seen, that the version of you other people held in their minds was always only what you could provide. I think about Paulette, and I don't feel what people probably expect me to feel. Not satisfaction, not warmth, not the clean resolution of a story that ends with the villain getting what they deserve. What I feel is something more like sadness, not for what she lost, but for the fact that she had, for years, a daughter-in-law who genuinely wanted to be part of her family and she chose to see a resource instead. That choice had consequences, not because the universe punishes greed. I don't believe in that kind of accounting, but because choices accumulate. The way you treat people shapes what they become capable of doing in return. Paulette spent years teaching me, very patiently, that I was not a person in her home. She taught me well, and then she was surprised by what I'd learned. Theo is a harder one. He is not a villain in any satisfying sense. He is someone who was never taught that other people's work is real, that money has a source, that a sister-in-law who builds software and manages projects and quietly solves problems you don't even know exist is doing something that deserves to be seen. Let alone that forging her name on legal documents has consequences that don't disappear just because you're charming about it. He was failed long before he failed me. That doesn't excuse anything. It just makes it less interesting to be angry about. What I learned from all of it, and I'm still learning honestly, I don't think I'm done, is that there are 3 things that actually protect you in life, and none of them are money, though money helps. The first is knowing your own worth clearly enough that you can tell the difference between being generous and being taken advantage of. That's a moral clarity, a sense of what's right that you have to build yourself, deliberately, over time. It doesn't come automatically just because you're a good person. I was a good person for 6 years and it didn't protect me at all. What finally protected me was being honest. First with myself about what was actually happening, and then with Liam, and then with Irene, and eventually with a process server in Coatlam. The second thing is using your mind. Sitting down with a spreadsheet on a Saturday morning when part of you really doesn't want to know. Asking the accountant the hard questions. Calling the lawyer before you do anything else. Thinking before you act, even when you're hurt, even when the version of you that just wants to burn it all down is very loud. Theo and Paulette bet on me being too emotional to think clearly. They were wrong. The third thing is the willingness to see something through, even when it's exhausting, even when it costs you more than you expected, even when people you care about look at you like you're a stranger. Liam called me relentless once during those months, and I wasn't sure if it was a compliment. Now I am. You have to be willing to finish what you started. Not out of revenge. That's a terrible reason to do anything, and it burns more of you than it burns of them. But because the alternative is returning to a version of your life that you already know doesn't work. I think about the young women I met at that information session in Vancouver. Sharp, tired, working without a margin for error. I didn't tell them my whole story, but I told them the part that matters. What you build is yours. Know it, protect it, and surround yourself with people who can say the same of what they build, who don't need what you've made in order to feel like they're worth something. That kind of person exists. They're just quieter than the other kind.